Warning! I'm going to start off this video by saying that with this what if video I tried doing two very big things. One, following the world as realistically as possible of what would happen, and two, trying to create a somewhat interesting story based off these events. And I will fully admit now I kind of failed at number one. This is my first what if video I've ever done, and I kind of got excited in the story and did give some people some plot armor just because I wanted to have a fulfilling conclusion to their story. If I ever were to do a what if video in the future, or even redo this one, I would probably try to lean more into what would actually happen instead of an interesting story. So if it would annoy you to watch this what if video where it's not going to be fully about like what would logically happen all the time, then you are welcome to leave, dislike, whatever. Now with that being said, what if DJ wasn't Lions? Yeah. Okay, we're actually starting all the way back here because this is when he originally made the alliance with Chef. The alliance never happening at all. And I think Chef would still want an alliance because Chef seemed kind of, we could see especially in World Tour, that he kind of wanted to have an alliance because he wanted to win the money. Like he wanted to be able to split it with whoever won by making an alliance with them. So I considered who he would make alliance with and said now that he wouldn't make it with DJ. Since I guess in this world he just wouldn't ask DJ. Justin, who I saw as he was like the first person who came into my head when I realized Chef needs a different alliance. Because he kind of checks off every mark that Chef would need. He's manipulative. He's shown that in the first episode over here. He's shown that he wants to play the game. He's villainous. He's someone who nobody would really suspect. And Chef has a very crucial line he says when he makes the alliance with DJ, which is when I was rewatching when I realized it would be Justin, and which is that he says he sees himself in DJ. And I think he would see himself in Justin because he would like maybe not be like arrogant, but it'd be kind of comedic for him to be like he thinks he was just as beautiful as Justin. So I think now they would have an illegal alliance. In the first challenge, most things kind of stay the same because the only thing that's happening is that he has an illegal alliance with Justin now. Nothing else is really changing too much. I was thinking if he would throw the challenge for Justin because they're an alliance. Because the challenge was both teams had to choose an actor to play out the roles, and they had to act out for Chef, and Chef would have to say which one is better. And Izzy was for this team, and Duncan was for this team. I don't see any reason why why is he not moving? I don't see any reason why these would change. I don't think Justin would want to act. I don't think he would like need to act. And I don't think Chef could do it because Izzy was so bad and Duncan was so good that he brought him to tears. So I don't think Chef could lie enough to like do that. Justin would then confront Chef about like not helping him in the challenge, and Chef would just kind of tell him to shut up and stop complaining and that he needs to take charge of the team because he wants him to be a leader. Chef, because Chef, that's kind of what Chef did with DJ, is that he wanted to be a somewhat mentor to him. Even though he was helping him cheat, he still wanted him to be able to do things on his own, and I could see that similar thing happening with Justin. He would specifically tell Justin to target Trent, since Trent and Gran are kind of the unofficial team leaders of these teams because they're the ones who made them. And also he's just generally the biggest threat that Chef would think there is on the team. I don't think he would think Lizzie or Beth or FX are both kind of dumb. Owen's kind of dumb too. And Izzy's crazy, but she doesn't really have a working mind enough to like want to, get out bad people. So I think he would view Trent as Justin's biggest threat, and he would advocate to Justin to get rid of Trent. And Justin, I think, could very easily pull over Lindsay and Beth, just seeing how easily manipulated they were by him in the first episode. And honestly, I could also see him pulling over Owen, because Owen also has a little crush on him. Izzy is kind of, up in the air, but I think with Owen voting with Justin, I do think Izzy would vote for Justin too, making Trent our first boot of the season. You could say that like these people really wouldn't want to vote out Justin because it doesn't really make sense, but I also just think these people don't really know Trent too well. They don't really know too much about him, they don't have any real in-depth connections to him. So I don't really see a reason why any of them would be opposed to voting him out, especially when they're manipulated by Justin, who's obviously like debilitating good looking. This is a non-elimination, it doesn't really matter. I rewatched the entire episode to see if there's anything that would change majorly. I don't think there's anything that's like massively changed by anything. Now I was thinking about all the things that would happen in this episode, and it's kind of hard to tell exactly where things would happen now that Trent's gone, because Trent played a very crucial role in certain things happening. The big thing is that this team now doesn't really have anyone who's throwing. They don't have anyone who's actively trying to not win. And both challenges, I think Izzy would be really good at. I could see her being really good at being acrobatic and jumping off a large ledge to go somewhere that seems right up her alley, considering how agile she was on Island. And I could see her being really good at, like, lassoing for some reason, because that's just what she's like. I don't really have all the information to say what would happen, but I really feel that with this team now not having anyone trying to sabotage them, and Izzy who'd be really good at these challenges, I could see them winning, because I don't really see a way in which the gaffers would be able to do well. Like, rewatching it, Justin and Beth instantly catch DJ and Heather just, like, quickly. Gwen was about to be caught by Trent, but then Trent, threw lasso, was like, oh, didn't get it because he's throwing the challenge. I would now say that Izzy's in the spots where Trent isn't, and even that's kind of a bit of a leap of logic, because obviously she could be in different spots. But I'm just going to assume that, and I'm assuming that Izzy would very easily then catch Gwen. And I don't think these three could really originally, like these three and Gwen get rope over their own and then tie up everyone else. And I do think they could easily kind of get these four, but Izzy is very agile, as we saw, and I just cannot see a way in which any of these people could catch her in a lasso. It just seems completely unfathomable to me. So I do think they would win the challenge, and now the gaffers would be going to elimination. Very easily, Harold and Duncan would be voting for each other, or want to vote for each other, since they both dislike each other a lot. I think Heather would work with Harold, because Heather says a line this episode where she says something along the lines of, like, which Harold's helping her, and she says, he seems easy to manipulate, I want to work with him. And even though we don't really see that happen in the show, since the fact that she said that tells me that there is a reason for me to believe that they would work together, especially since the special on Island, teach them kind of like being a somewhat alliance. So I would think that they'd vote together, especially since Harold would want anybody to vote for Duncan. Gwen would go along with Duncan, as we saw him get along very well originally, and DJ also got along with Duncan really well. And I do think Lashana would want to vote with these three, because she is close to them, but she's also much closer to Harold. She would really, really not want to vote at Harold. She could easily convince people like Gwen and DJ that Heather is the one who needs to go, since they all don't like Heather. And even though Duncan's kind of, upset because he wants Harold to go after what he did to Courtney, I think he would agree with the group's consensus that Heather's more, dangerous, and also that she kind of deserves it more. So I think Heather would go out 4-2 with their votes. So for the first part of the prison challenge, they have to choose someone to put in the cage. And I rewatched the episode, and they actually don't know anything about what is going to happen to this person. Like, even Owen has a line, like, when they're going to choose Gwen because they blackmail her at this point, like, we don't know what we're doing, we could be taking her out of the challenge, we could be doing something wrong. So that tells me they have no idea who the person they're choosing, like, what's going to happen to them at all. But I think because there's a jail cell there, I think both teams would kind of assume that they're, like, choosing a person to sit out of the challenge. So I think this side would obviously, now not having blackmail against Gwen, I think they choose Duncan, since Duncan's, like, a juvie person, and he's been, like, to jail, supposedly. So I think they'd think, like, he has the most prison knowledge and stuff, so if it's, like, those sort of things, then he would do very well. This team would still choose Lindsay, because Gwen has a line she says when they're deciding who to choose, when, like, she's talking about a story with Lindsay of how she got really claustrophobic inside a bathroom and, like, freaked out. She'd think, like, that same thing could happen. And I actually went back through the original Island challenge, where it was a bunch of discussing this, because I didn't actually know how Duncan would fare in this challenge, because we've never really seen him eat anything except for in World Tour, which he didn't do that good in. But he's someone I genuinely don't really see as someone who'd be, like, bad at eating challenges. But I could not find a single clip of him in Bunch of Discussing This of him eating anything. But I also couldn't find anything of him throwing up. And considering just how bad Lindsay is with these sort of things, I think it's very obvious that she would lose. But I noticed one very, very distinct thing in this episode. And I am kind of leaning into it a bit too much, but when Chris gives them their gross foods that the other teams have made for them, he only says try not to throw up, and whoever throws up first would lose it for their team. But he never says that you have to eat the food. He never says the words, you have to finish the meal, first to finish would win. He only says whoever throws up first would lose. And I think Duncan, being kind of smart and, in prison, he'd kind of like notice those little tricks. And especially since he just wouldn't want to eat what they've given to him, I think he would just completely abstain from eating it. And Lindsay, seeing this, would also abstain. And now, since none of them have technically lost the challenge, since neither of them, weren't following what he said, Chris would get annoyed and just call it a tie, and no one would get the golden shovel. I see this making the most sense, and I see it fitting Duncan's character of being like kind of sly and sneezy about those, little technicalities. It is very possible that once Duncan brings this up, Chris would just be like, no, you have to eat it, and then they'd eat it, in which case Lindsay would obviously lose, and they'd get the golden shovel. But that doesn't necessarily matter, and I'll tell you why later. DJ was originally the one who was amped to push the cart in the second part of the challenge, but Gren convinced him not to because of blackmail. She didn't want him to do that because that'd be a big advantage. But now that she has no reason to convince him not to do it, I think DJ would be very okay with doing it. And Owen was kind of lazy in the original. He didn't want to push it. He just sat in the thing. But now that Izzy is still here, I could very much see Izzy scaring him and intimidating him and threatening him to push the cart, and Owen would get scared because he's scared of Izzy. So now I think we have two good pushers, and I can't really tell who has the edge. Both of them are very big guys in the show, and I genuinely couldn't see how one would have an advantage over the other. So I kind of just said they both tied and got to the end part. So the teams are very, very close, and it was kind of hard for me to tell who would win with that and who would lose with that. So I started trying to examine who would be good at these things, who would be good at digging. And that's a really weird thing to try and figure out with contestants, because I don't have that many clips of people digging. So I kind of had to go more just off of personality and things. I think Izzy would be probably the best out of everyone. She's also kind of, again, wacky and good at random things. We even see her in the episode acting as a gopher, so I think she'd easily be the best. However, the problem is I can't see anyone else in her team doing good. I don't see Beth or Lindsay being good at it. Justin wouldn't want to dig because he wouldn't want to break his nails. Meanwhile, on the other side, I do think that in general, there's not as any of them who are as good as Izzy. But I think overall, they would all be able to do better than her. I think Duncan would be very good because he's an ex-convict. We see DJ acting like an animal in Island, which is kind of weird, but I could see him being like an animal, acting like that, like a gopher or something, and digging really well. Also, he's kind of a big guy and more in shape. Harold is kind of a gray area, but I could see him having some weird badge from camp or something about digging campfire pits or something like that. Gren probably wouldn't be the best, and Lashana also probably wouldn't be that good, but unlike these three, I think she'd be willing to dig, even though she might dirty up her hands. And so it's really hard to tell with this, but I do think the Gaffers would win just because they have more collective, better diggers. Even though Izzy's definitely the best, I don't see the rest of her team being good at this at all. And that's why earlier I said with the Golden Shovel, it doesn't really matter, because even if these guys did win the Golden Shovel, they still would have won. So now that means the Grips are going to elimination. Chef, after the challenge, would get really mad with Justin for not performing well, because this is when we started kind of get the somewhat foreshadowing of Justin being lazy and not competent in challenges and just kind of using people, and Chef, again, being the mentor to him as much as he's the cheater to him, would want him to work in the challenges and prove that he's a good team leader. So I think he'd get really mad with Justin and start trying to tutor him on how to actually work in challenges more and be a team player. That's starting to build to some of the things happening later. We have two obvious duos here. We have Beth and Lindsay, who are very close, and we have Owen and Izzy, who are both very close. So I would make Justin the swing vote of these two duos. And I don't know, I can't tell exactly where he'd go, but I do think he'd lean Lindsay and Beth, because he knows that he can manipulate them easier. And I do think, after just having the speech with Chef about wanting to be a team player, and even though Owen hasn't proven to be the worst, Izzy has proven to be very good in challenges. Meanwhile, Owen is kind of lazy and somewhat of a liability. And since he won last season, Justin definitely wouldn't want to keep him around. So I think you could convince Lindsay and Beth, even though they'd both be more scared of Izzy, that Owen is the worst person to keep around, and Owen would get eliminated in a 3-2 vote. Again, another non-elimination, doesn't really matter. I considered what Gwen would do in this situation instead of Heather, and what Izzy would do. I don't think it really matters. I still think Izzy, she wouldn't study, but she would be like crazy enough to like believe when everything's happening. Gwen probably would study and then also fall for the same thing everyone else fell for, which is like they read about disorders and stuff and then they develop them. So Gwen would be in the same place. And again, Lashana and Duncan would still win it for their team. And Lashana would still cry and get the reward. So I don't see anything really changing here. I still think it's the exact same sort of idea. Now this one, I think, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it's the one I have the most notes for. So yeah, have fun. Might be a small thing, but this is something I noticed at the very beginning of the episode, and it's something I do think is actually kind of important. Is that in the very beginning, Heather makes fun of Lindsay's intelligence. She like pokes fun of her for like not being very smart, and this is kind of the start of Lindsay starting her like leadership, whole thing where she wants to be, in charge and prove everyone she's smart. And I don't think she'd do that now because now she doesn't have someone ostracizing her intelligence. I think she'd just be okay with being, silly and dumb now. So she wouldn't take charge in this episode at all because Heather is not here to, provoke that. Originally, the two scarers were DJ and Beth, but DJ was forced into the role by Chef, but Chef would have no reason to force DJ into that role now, and I think they would all agree to choose Duncan since they were already agreeing to choose that in the original, just because he's the most scary. And with this side, it is kind of hard to tell, but Izzy's just like so naturally freaky, and I think they'd all just agree that they'd want her. And now that Lindsay isn't taking charge, she wouldn't stand up to everyone and be like, Beth has to be the scarer because of her screaming thing, because Lindsay just, isn't caring about any of that stuff anymore. And Justin does advocate for a little bit because he wants the mask because it covers his face and it's good protection. But I think after, talks with Chef, he would realize, challenges are important and he'd let Izzy go first since she'd probably be the best at it. The first people to get scared on both teams, in this case, I said Harold and Justin because that is what happened in the original. They were both in the forest. I think Duncan would do very well in scaring Harold, and I do think Justin would be afraid of Izzy, but since Harold kind of has like some real life trauma there of Duncan bullying him all the time, I do think he'd give a more authentic scream, because maybe Duncan would go like the extra mile or something and like real life bully him. So I do think they'd win the first scare off. Next one is Lindsay and Lashana, who are the original people getting scared before. Duncan would kind of see some hilarity in the situation of Lashana being on the toilet. I don't think he'd take the scare very seriously, so I don't think he'd give a good enough, scare to like make Lashana yell good. And Lindsay was shown to be very easily scared, so she definitely would give off the better yell, so they would then get a point. So now we are tied 1-1 for each. Now, this is the scene for kissing, but the grips are actually down a player, because originally Izzy returns here, so why did I voice crack? Originally Izzy returns here, so the numbers are 5-5 on each team, but I didn't have that happen, so now we have one player less. However, I still think this situation works, because I think the kissing scene would have Gwen and DJ for this team, which would be weird, but then they have Beth, like Chris would give her like a dummy or something and like make fun of her because she, no one would want to kiss her. Beth being kind of a fangirl and the weirdo she was, I think she would then, take it to heart and then start making out with the doll like intensely just to kind of stick it to Chris. And then since she can't yell, Izzy would try to scare her, but she wouldn't be able to give a good authentic scream, and she'd also be kind of preoccupied with kissing. And Gwen and DJ, I could both see just completely disagreeing to kiss. I think they'd both just completely not want to kiss at all. DJ wouldn't want to force her to kiss him because, he's like respectful and nice and he wouldn't want that for her. And Gwen at this point is still actually dating Trent because Trent left before they could actually have the entire breakup scene. So they would both just not want to kiss, and even though with the pressuring of like Chris and stuff, they just wouldn't do it. But Duncan would make DJ scream really well, and he'd probably give like the best scream of the entire challenge. But I then think Chris wouldn't really give either team the win, since Beth followed the rules of what they wanted to happen with the kiss, but she didn't give a better scream. And Gwen and DJ didn't follow the kiss, but they did give a better scream. So I think, again, he'd kind of view it as a tie. And I think this kind of works because in the original, the grips didn't really have an advantage in the second part of the challenge. It wasn't like they had a huge advantage. But I did say that I got rid of they had like ghost meters to tell them, paranormal activity. I think I just get rid of those because those are kind of unfair in the challenge. and that would give them an advantage. But now that the challenge is considered like completely fair since no team got the advantage of the original, I just say that they wouldn't get those and the challenge would continue on as normal. At the beginning of this episode, in the beginning of this episode, Chef and DJ originally meet, but now Chef and Justin would meet, and Chef would need to give like Justin information about challenges to do well, since he's starting to kind of get worried because their numbers are becoming less. So he would tell Justin that the story that they are going to hear in the tent is completely fake. It is made up. It is not real. So Justin would then kind of take over the role of Lindsay originally, where Lindsay would be advocating for everyone to stay because, things don't match up. But now Justin, wanting to win challenges for Chef and himself, would then play that role of poking holes in the logic of it, being paranormal activity. The same things would happen originally with Harold doing the soccer ball and Duncan doing the fake blood and Justin poking holes for both of that. And I still do think DJ would find this method he did before of scaring, them. So that wasn't based off like him being sad or anything. That was just genuinely an idea he had that he didn't want to tell because he didn't want to scare anybody. But, some pressuring by Lashana, who is still here, then I think he would still come up with the same idea. With all the undeniable evidence of like, a ghost hanging above the thing, and now that they don't have like ghost meters to tell him, Justin would believe that the story was real and that Chef was just like wrong, and everybody would leave, and the Screaming Gaffers would win the challenge still. DJ would have no reason to quit anymore, and with this vote, since he is already kind of committed to Beth and Lindsay and can manipulate them, even though he does care about the challenges, I think he would then just have to decide he has to get rid of Izzy, because he can't. The best he can do is cause a tie, and like if he causes a tie, and then by the off chances like whoever he has Izzy tie with, like Beth, wins, then Beth and Lindsay are both against Justin. And even if Izzy does win, it doesn't really put him in a good spot, because now he has Lindsay and Izzy, who are both kind of mad at him for voting out, the other half of their duos. And they would probably make some, counter alliance against Justin. So I think Justin would just realize he has to go with the numbers and have a free one vote on Izzy. Now, this is a non-elimination, so it shouldn't be a point until I actually saw it and I realized a couple things. Originally, when the earthquake happens, Lindsay falls in and Justin grabs her, but I think he would have a pre-talk with Chef, and Chef would tell him like, hey, that's going to happen, so when the ground starts to rumble, get away from the center. So once the ground rumbles, I think Justin would instantly tell Lindsay, back off and go towards our side, and Lindsay would move and she'd see it fall, and she'd be thankful, but she'd also be kind of curious about how Justin would know that, and I would kind of start to get a fishy vibe from Justin. Owen isn't here to get smashed by the big book anymore and have his jaw broken, so I was thinking who would have that happen, because obviously Chef would still throw the book, and I was thinking like it would have to happen to this team because him and Justin have an alliance, so he wouldn't want to throw the big book at them and potentially hurt them. When I rewatched the clip, he threw a lot of other things that were a lot more dangerous than a book. He threw like chainsaws and knives, so I don't think him throwing a book to him would be like inherently dangerous. So now I think Justin would actually get hit in the face with the book and have his like face damaged. And originally the grips win because Owen got damaged the most, because he said that, which was stupid. Now that Justin got injured the most, the groups would still win the advantage. This is for the second part of this challenge where they're getting flooded. I don't think Justin would be there, similarly to how Owen wasn't there because he got injured. I think Justin just wouldn't be there. And the advantage they got in the original was a piece of paper that had a code on it. And in the original, Izzy was the first one to realize that, it was a code to the exit door. So they wouldn't figure that out instantly. But the reason why they lose the paper is because Lindsay and Justin fight over, having the paper because both want to enter the code, and they drop it in the water. But now that Justin isn't here, they wouldn't have a fight. And I do think Lindsay and Beth could eventually figure out, it is a code to that door before the room floods up to a point where it'd be too hard to do it. Especially since the second that they actually get the code itself, Beth is the first one to realize it's a code. So I don't think it would take them too long to realize, connect 2 and 2 and realize that's what needs to happen, and then open the door and win the challenge. Now, this does affect one massive thing, in that originally the Scaffers find out Lashana lied in I deleted it, but in the hospital challenge, a fake cry to get her reward, because while they were flooding and while they were drowning, Harold's like, you don't have to cry, Lashana, it's okay, and Lashana's like, I never cry, and then they think oh wait, why would she cry before, and they realized she was manipulating them. But now that I think Beth and Lindsay would get it fairly quickly, I think they would not have enough time for like the room to flood up significantly to a point where they think they're gonna die. So I don't think anyone in the gaffers would actually now figure out that, you know, Lashana lied about that. I think that would still remain a secret. Again, non-elimination. There's some big things there still. Okay, earlier when I said sandwich project had the most, I think I lied. I'm pretty sure this one actually has the most. Now, first thing first, Owen isn't here, and Owen doesn't need the shake that helps him with his like intestine stomach problems. So now Lashana wouldn't be able to drink the shake that like makes her really gassy. So I guess that kind of comes into part later, which is you know, real interesting. And her team would still be genuinely nice to her and not make her stressed out because, you know, they don't know about the lying and crying. So they'd still be genuinely nice to her and she wouldn't be outcasted. Even though Heather's thing didn't happen here, I still do think Lindsay would like want to be in charge of things and is kind of tired of being treated like, you know, an idiot. Admiral Lindsay would still be born in this challenge and still kind of take over. Especially now since Justin just got his face damaged. He definitely can't charm Lindsay and Beth into doing what he wants now because, you know, they just don't think he's attractive anymore. And now, in the original, they have the very, very first part that's not even really considered a challenge. It's just jumping out of the plane, which is not a real plane. But Owen jumps out the plane and, you know, fat jokes. So the entire plane tilts to the side and everyone falls out of the plane. But now that Owen isn't here, that wouldn't happen. So now everyone here would have to jump out of the plane thinking it's a real plane on their like own accord. And I do think everyone here would do it except for DJ. DJ has shown a lot of points in the series where he's been cowardice, you know, about these sort of things. And I think he would just straight up deny wanting to do that. He would just completely not want to take any part in it. And I did consider this, and this might seem a little plot heavy, but considering that this challenge is genuinely just a numbers challenge, like you're literally fighting. If you have more numbers and you're fighting, like you're gonna win. So I think Chris kind of being like annoyed that DJ didn't jump, he would kick him out from the challenge, like the rest of the challenge, and just kind of say like, you know, he's not a part of them anymore since he didn't want to go to war. Like making a paint bomb challenge, the grips don't really do anything. They kind of argue a bunch and then Izzy sets up a bunch of things, but now that Izzy isn't here, they can't even set up those explosions, and Duncan actually does a really good job. So now the gaffers would win, you know, the casing again still, because the grips would have actually nothing to show Chris, because they kind of just sit around and talk about doing things, but they don't actually do it. And now that Izzy isn't here, they don't even have a big explosion to like show. So the gaffers would still win the case. After that whole discussion of like Justin like saying, hey, you beautiful ladies, can you do it? You know, like what he does in the original, and they don't listen. I think Justin would realize he's on the bottom and that they are now closer, and that if they were to lose again, Justin would be in trouble. And Justin, I think, would have genuinely no idea of what he can do to prevent this from happening. So I think he would actually just talk to Chef and say like, I'm in a lot of trouble, I need you to help me. And Chef would agree. Duncan goes off to make traps in the original, and I do think he'd still go, and I think Gwen would actually go with him, because at this point they have been getting really close together. They have been hanging out a lot longer. You know, like originally they kind of developed feelings for each other and dated like in World Tour after only knowing each other for like what, this long, which is like 4 episodes. Now they've known each other for about, what is that, 11 episodes. So they've been getting very close, and I think Gwen would want to hang out with Duncan more and go set up traps, leaving Harold and Lashana to dig the pit, which I don't really see being too big of a deal, because I still think they'd be able to dig a substantial pit to hide things in. So they'd still have their underground base. But now Duncan and Gwen would go off to set up traps. This is how Chef would help Justin. Chef would go through the woods as they're setting up traps, and like, well, they have a little flirty moment of them like talking to each other and getting, you know, smiley. Chef would push them back into like a snare trap that would hold them up into the air, and I don't think they'd be able to get out of it, because he'd like make sure the pocket knife falls or something, and he'd also make sure that they don't see him when he does this. But by doing this, he'd officially take them out of the challenge, because now they'd just be stuck in like some snare trap, you know, in the middle of the woods. So now it's just these 3 versus Harold and Lashana, and I think Justin would tell his team like, hey, we should go attack now while Duncan and Gwen are out setting traps. And even though they don't really like respect him, they would still listen and they think it's a good idea, and they'd go attack. And Harold would still, you know, beat both of the Lindsay and Beth with his yo-yo skills, which is what he does originally, except he beats the entire team. But now he doesn't have like a fart wall to use as a flank, which is really important. so fucking stupid. But anyway, I think he would probably very easily beat Lindsay and Beth with his fighting skills. And now here is where I think Chef would help with the second part of Justin. Even though Justin has a very messed up face, Justin still has like a good body, and I think he'd take off his shirt, and Lashana would kind of get a little like flustered and blushy, you know, because since he's still a good looking guy. And then Harold would get kind of defensive about it since he likes Lashana. And Chef would send a massive paint bomb to come attack their area with a catapult, and Justin, knowing it's gonna come, he would go hide behind like a tree or like a rock. Lashana and Harold would both get covered in paint, and Justin would escape with the case very easily. Chris would kind of be upset with Chef, being like, hey, why'd you do that? That's interfering with the challenge. But I think Chef could very easily pass it off as just being like, oh, it's a war theme, you know, I fought an air bomb, it fits the war theme, I just wanted to make the challenge more interesting. And the gaffers would be going to elimination. Again, I still think Harold and Duncan would want to vote each other out. You know, Gwen's kind of unofficially with Duncan, and Lashana's kind of unofficially working with Harold. But I don't think Lashana would want to vote for Duncan, and I don't think Gwen would necessarily want to vote for Harold. Both of them don't really want to vote for the other person, because they don't really have any beef with them. And I think they'd kind of started seeing that Duncan and Harold rivalry is kind of childish and unnecessary. So I think Lashana, realizing how weak DJ was today, and Gwen also kind of seeing that, they would both baby like their respective partners into voting DJ off, since he's kind of becoming a liability to them at this point. Again, Lashana wouldn't be outcasted because nobody knows about her lie, so now Lashana wouldn't be kidnapped because she'd just be having a normal discussion. I do think Harold would probably get caught, since, you know, he's not really that close with any of these people except for Lashana, but I feel like Lashana, Gwen, and Duncan could all have like a normal conversation, and then like maybe Duncan would make fun of Harold, and Harold would get offended, and he'd like go to leave, and then he'd get kidnapped. That's what happens at the beginning. They kidnap people to put them in the sales. It's just who is ever away from the group so they can get them alone. And I think Beth and Lindsay would be, you know, girly and talking to each other and be attached like to the hip. So it'd be no time where they'd be away from each other where either one of them would get caught. So that would then just make Justin being caught because they would just be too close. It's really difficult to tell how this would happen of them opening the safes, since we don't really know how to open the safes. We don't know the code, we don't know intuition, we don't know, you know, safety breaches or anything like that. We know nothing, because we didn't even get it in the original. So it couldn't even be like a thing like if it was Chris's, you know, shampoo number or something, or who would get that. I have no way to determine who would open the doors. But what I do think would happen is I think Lindsay and Beth would kind of get tired of Justin. You know, they kind of realize now he's just kind of like an arrogant personality who's full of himself, and Justin would kind of freak out being locked in the thing and complain a lot. And Lindsay would just like kind of joke with Beth like of them leaving him. And then I think they'd both actually just want to leave him because they don't really like him anymore. And I think since they both just have no idea of how to open it, they'd just give up and leave. And I think Gwen and Duncan would see this and also realize that, you know, they're gonna get a head start, so they just have to go because they're wasting time here trying to get Harold. And Lashana would be somewhat hesitant but realize she needs to go for the, you know, good of the team, so they would all just leave. And I think this would actually set up a big thing for Justin, where I think he'd realize, you know, he's alone with Harold, and Harold's kind of heartbroken that his entire team just left him. So Justin would then start trying to work on making an alliance with Harold while they're both trapped in their safes, because we did see that like voices went through the vents to the outside, so it would make sense that the vents could still connect to each other, and that Harold and Justin, if they talked loud enough, could hear each other. So I think Justin would start working on an alliance with him in there. But then continuing on to the normal challenge, I genuinely just think Beth and Lindsay would forget that they need supplies. And even if they did, remember, I don't see a way in which they could get like the bank robbing supplies. So I would say they'd get to the bank set quicker than this team, but they would still do the same thing of the original of Duncan, like using all of Harold's stuff to make like fake bank robbing kit. So when they get here, I still think they would win. Courtney would give them the advantage because she likes Duncan, and they did generally do a better job. And now this is where Courtney gets added back, and since she is second place prize and this team came in second place, I do see her getting added here. Now Owen, the original reason why this team, the Grips, had to like carry their cart is because Owen broke one of the wheel sets. But now since Owen isn't here, that just wouldn't happen, and I think they would just make the cart, since Courtney, you know, is pretty bossy and she'd want them to work. However, Duncan works really, really quick on the cart in the original. The reason because, he, strips cars and it's just like stripping a car in reverse. So I think even with them actually having, a car now, I still think the gaffers would win because Duncan is just undeniably better than everyone else here at making a cart. So I do think they would still win the challenge and the grips would have to eliminate someone. Chris would still say the same thing of like Courtney can't get voted out because, she came back. Now, I also think Chef being alliance with Justin would really want him to make sure he's safe, and knowing that he was advocating the other day like how he's in trouble, he would make a plea to Chris that Justin, shouldn't be viable to vote out since he didn't even get to compete in the challenge. And Chris would probably go along with this because Justin has been this season's villain so far. And I think Chris would also kind of just agree that it would be really boring to have the season's villain voted out pre-merge in a challenge he couldn't even compete in. And again, plot armor. But the main reason why this doesn't really matter is that if Justin wasn't immune, Beth and Lindsay would vote together, and Justin and Courtney would probably also vote together, because Justin's very strategic now, and Courtney's also very strategic, and I could see them working together. And I don't know who they would vote for, probably Beth because she's smarter, but like, I think Justin could beat Beth in most things when it comes to tiebreakers. Like, the only thing I could see Beth beating Justin in is like an intelligence challenge, but Courtney is still here with Justin. Like, they're having the tiebreaker in front of everybody. We see that in World Tour. So Courtney would help Justin win any single intelligence, and I do think Courtney is smarter than Beth. So even if it was a tie and it did have to go to a tiebreaker, Beth would still go. So it doesn't really matter that I'm giving him immunity here, but I just want to do that because I think it'd be a nice like story when Beth and Lindsay, realize one of us has to go, and it's kind of like a farewell moment. And again, I think Justin and Courtney would vote Beth because I think Beth is just genuinely smarter. And Lindsay and Beth would just vote for, the other person because they have to. Maybe they'd vote for Courtney just hoping that their votes go through, even though Chris specifically says they don't. But I do think Beth would get eliminated here with Courtney's and Justin's vote. It's a reward challenge, again, doesn't really matter. The only thing I did think about is how Courtney would still be treating Duncan badly, but now that Gwen's really close with Duncan, she would be sympathizing with him and telling him, like, you shouldn't have to be treated like that. That's not very good. And Duncan would kind of agree, and he'd kind of be like less obsessed with Courtney and not really care too much about her. So now that would kind of upset Courtney more, and she'd kind of get more aggressive. But that's the only thing I could really think of. Everything else was pretty non-mandatory. Even the reward in this challenge didn't matter. It was like ribs that got knocked into a tar pit, so it really does not matter. At the very beginning of this episode, they have a like fake little war thing on a field where they all perform in a challenge, and they say this is to decide the order of the matchups, but they never ever say how it decides the order. They never say this decides the order, we go from strongest to weakest. I even looked at the wiki, it doesn't say what this determined, but there is a line when Harold and Lindsay face off against each other in the marshmallow boxing match. He says we gotta work our way up from weakest to strongest. So based off that, I am just going to assume that the order is based off people who performed worse in the challenge. The original challenge was basically just a physicality challenge to best. That's the only way I can interpret what was said. So based on that, for Screaming Gaffers, it would be Harold. I don't think Lashana would do very good because she doesn't really seem the most agile, and she does have a lot of strength, but I didn't really see that with the challenge. There was a lot of like crawling through mud and stuff like that. Duncan would be the best, which by default would then make Gwen here. And I do think Lindsay would do the worst as original, and I do think even though Justin is more challenge oriented, he's still kind of like a pretty boy, doesn't want to get messy and stuff. So I think he'd do the worst, well, middle, and Courtney would do the best. So based off this, in this original matchup, Harold would still win because he did. But originally what happens during this challenge is Courtney on the side has her PDA drop out of her pocket, and Beth picks it up to look through her phone to like contact her fake boyfriend. But I think Justin, being manipulative now, he would find the PDA and he would still want to look through it because, he wants to see what's on there. He just wants outside the contact world. And Justin would find the clip of Lashana, talking to her friend in the limousine after the hospital challenge, like lying about crying. So now Justin would have the information. So Harold would still win, but now Justin has the information, and Justin facing off against Lashana, I think he would realize Lashana is actually a pretty like strong competitor, and that he'd kind of had troubles beating her. So I think what he would do is he would tell everyone in the entire game about Lashana's lying, and he'd have Courtney pull it up on her PDA, showing the proof and showing him, and double whammy, also showing Lashana insulting everyone in the game so far. So I think everyone would be really, really mad at Lashana, and Lashana would be really disgruntled and upset about having her, secret revealed. And I think she'd be too distracted to be able to perform in the challenge well, so then Justin would get a point for this team. It's Courtney and Gwen in the wrestling challenge, originally where Courtney faced Duncan. Even though Gwen really dislikes Courtney in this timeline, she doesn't like the way she's treating Duncan, she thinks she's bossy and mean. Gwen's not inherently like a violent person. I do think she'd be aggressive with Courtney, but Courtney has an unhinged, crazy person amount of aggression that I don't think Gwen has any chance of beating to any extent. So I think Courtney very easily gets a point here. And since there are only 3 people, I am just going to assume for the last one that, Chris says something like, GURPS could choose anyone they want for the last challenge, and Courtney would probably volunteer since she is clearly the best performing. And then it's a basketball challenge between Courtney and Duncan. This is kind of a weird one because you can't really tell who has an advantage in a basketball challenge. Like, there is no indicator to tell me who would be good at basketball. So I kind of just really don't know. And I said Courtney just because I assume Duncan, doesn't really care, so he wouldn't really try that hard and he'd be like kind of passive aggressive. But I do see a way in which Duncan wins, in which case there would be a tie. However, that doesn't really matter because the Grips originally win the tie by, sucking up to Chris. And I think they'd still do that. So whoever Courtney or Duncan wins, it doesn't really matter because if Courtney wins, then she just, the Grips win, and if Duncan wins, it becomes a tie, and the Grips still win. And I do think everyone here would still be mad at Lashana, especially since it's so much more recent, that it would be really hard for anybody to not vote against Lashana. Gwen and Duncan would both feel very betrayed, and Harold would feel very betrayed, but he wouldn't want to vote her. But since Harold now kind of has a semi-alliance with Justin would talk to Harold and be like, I only showed you the clip because I didn't want you to have to live and lie or feel for this girl who doesn't treat you with respect. And Harold would kind of eat it up since he's so heartbroken in this moment, and especially since he was convinced by Courtney originally. I do think he'd be able to be convinced by Justin, so I do think they'd all agree to vote out Lashana after what she did. Before anyone mentions the fact that it does kind of matter who won the challenge before, because Lashana makes her apology tour to everybody during the tiebreaker, I did consider this, but I don't think it's enough to garner anybody to not vote her. It was enough in the original because they had Heather, and Heather was, outcasted and she wasn't really liked. But Gwen is someone who is generally liked. All these people are generally liked, and then it just all came out so quickly. I don't think an apology after getting that big hit right after it happened would be enough. So with that, we have our official merge cast. Looking mostly the same, only difference now is that we don't have Lashana and Beth. Dial M for merger, the first one. Again, this is a award challenge, doesn't really matter. I do think everything would still kind of go the same. Courtney would still win the first part of the challenge, so you'd be good at moving through lasers and still get it. And I think during the fake bomb timer where they all thought they were genuinely gonna die, this is when Gwen would hug Duncan. She'd also scream out that she has a crush on him, because they have known each other for a very long time at this point. And considering the fact that they fall for each other pretty quickly after action and then into World Tour, I could see Gwen genuinely developing emotions for Duncan. And I think while she says this would generally create a full-on rivalry between Courtney and Gwen at this point. They'd still go down with the zip line, and I think Lindsay would still get the wire by dumb luck. So if it really matters at all, Courtney won the first part of the challenge, Lindsay wins the second part of the challenge, and they go on their tour of cheeses. That's all you really need to know. Now, superhero ID, again, most things are the same. These 4 choose the same superheroes. Actually, these 5. I feel like Johnson would probably come with something cooler, because it's kind of hinted at in the show that he copied Beth, but Beth isn't here now. So I don't know, but also I just feel like he wouldn't want to copy anybody now, because now he has actual things, and Chef was the one, messing with everybody's stuff. And I think he just wouldn't mess with Justin, and Justin, would get a semi-good superhero. And Gwen would probably choose some, sort of emo goth sort of thing. But I don't think either of that really matters, because Lindsay was easily winning that. by a long shot. Lindsay had so much ass kissing from Chris. she was gonna win undeniably. It doesn't matter what anybody else did because Chris really liked Wonder Woman. So she would have the 10-second time advantage, but I don't really see Justin or Gwen doing, good in the actual relay race. I mean, Justin obviously just doesn't do that well originally, and Gwen I don't see being good at that sort of thing, and Courtney now being super upset and agile and quick and good already. I do think Courtney would win again, and she would have immunity from the vote. These two would vote as a block. Harold and Justin are both an alliance, and Justin also made an alliance with Courtney. Courtney would advocate really hard for Gwen to go, and Justin would tell Harold, like, hey, it's okay, we can give it to Gwen, and then we can give it to Duncan next. Just because there's no way Courtney would want anyone else gone besides Gwen. Even though she would be mad at Duncan, Duncan hasn't really done anything, and she's probably still thinking, like, Duncan likes her and whatnot. But, like, she knows that Gwen's doing it, and she doesn't want to admit she's jealous, but she's jealous. So this kind of puts Lindsay in the middle. Because if Lindsay goes here, then it's just a vote out. If Lindsay goes here, then it's a tie. And I can't really tell. I think Lindsay would start to catch on about Justin's antics, about how he's getting so good at things. Lindsay would still kind of be wary of Justin after, Earthquake and after he voted out Beth. But I think overall, Lindsay knows nothing about Duncan and Gwen, and she hasn't shown much of liking them. She doesn't dislike them, she doesn't think they're bad people, she just doesn't gel with them naturally. And I do think Lindsay does somewhat like Harold, and I do think even though she gets a fishy vibe from Justin, she doesn't really have enough to go off of to say it. And with all that, I think Lindsay would still realize, causing a tie is a risky move, because whoever survives that tie would be mad at her. So I think she'd just go along with the vote. And since Courtney would be advocating so hard for Gwen to go, I do believe Gwen would get voted out. I have gotten rid of all the other aftermaths because they don't really matter. They're just kind of after story building, and they really aren't anything worth talking about. But I added this one for a big reason. We have about, 3, 6, we have 7 episodes and 5 people. So I really need to do something to bring people back, and I didn't know how. So I figured since in World Tour they kind of had a challenge where someone was brought back, they would have the same thing for an aftermath, except I don't think it'd be a conventional challenge. I think fitting into the sort of the Hollywood, movie films theme, based it off a audience popularity vote of all previous past eliminated contestants of who would come back into the game. And I have them all listed here in what I believe the order from least to most votes would be based on that. First things first, I think Gwen would be bottom. Everybody would not like her for, kind of cheating on Duncan. Well, cheating on Trent with Duncan. Even though she hasn't done anything with Duncan, everybody would just really dislike that because they think Gwen and Trent are real cute. And she's kind of a hypocrite for, treating Trent so badly in the first season when she thought it happened. I think she'd get the lowest vote. Everyone would absolutely despise her, and it'd be kind of a running joke that she's the new Heather now. And speaking of Heather, I definitely think she'd be the second least. She just wouldn't have a general audience that likes her at all, and she's kind of, she made it far last time, and she's still kind of a mean person. And Lashana would also have a decently low score for being more villainous and manipulating everyone this season. I don't think it'd be a low score. Maybe it's 3 times as much as Heather's, but it still just wouldn't be that high. And I do think Izzy is someone who would have a kind of high receiving vote, but then she'd get upset that her votes go down a bit, and she'd go crazy and become really aggressive and start cursing out the camera, and then her vote would drop down more. Owen, I think, is next because even though he's really liked and he has a big audience, I think the 2 people above him are just generally more likable. And he already won the first season, so I could see a lot of people not wanting to vote him because they don't want, a winner to come back and win again. They want someone else to win the money. And that leaves, let's add him up here now, DJ and Trent. In second place would be DJ. Because DJ is very, very liked, and I do think there'd be kind of a plead for him if he kind of got misjudged because everyone voted him out because they thought he wasn't capable. He'd make a plea that he would try again, and he would try hard if he got back. But Trent has just always been likable, and now that he has the sort of thing of Gwen cheating, being painted as the villain, and him the hero, he'd get the most votes. And with that, he'd be brought back. Chris would come after the show. Oh, you got a new player, you vote back, that's great. But in Hollywood, there are heroes and villains. He would bring the least voted player back as well, which in this case would be Gwen. Gwen would try to not, be part of it. She said, I don't want to come back. I don't want to be part of the show. and Chris would tell her it's not her choice and would be upset that she brought back, but Chris would do it because he wants, more drama, especially with the whole breakup thing. And you can be saying I'm doing this for convenience, and you're not wrong. The main reason why I did this is because, we can talk about it later, but I'll just talk about it now to save time. In Rock and Rule, Owen gets brought back for the issues with his job, like being unfairly taken out. The problem is I cannot think of anyone in this cast who would be able to be brought back for being like voted out unfairly. So that means I wouldn't be able to bring anybody back here, and then there would only be like 6 people till the end, which I could do, but it would just be like kind of boring, and it wouldn't really have the right number of players. So I did bring Gwen back because I needed more players to make up for the lack of returns I had before. And I do think it's kind of lame that Gwen is voted out one episode before and then she's instantly brought back, but I just see that being the way that Chris would want the situation to go. Right now, Gwen and Trent actually haven't been like put back in the official cast yet. And the candidates for the Glass Slipper, Chris said originally it was who won the last challenge, Superhero ID, the first part and the second part, which was Lindsay and Courtney. Lindsay obviously couldn't win it because she had massive feet, so Courtney would again still become princess, and these would be the knights. They would go to the challenge set, and then Chris would reveal Trent and Gwen are back in the game. They're both kind of hesitant, and Courtney is like fuming mad that Gwen is back, but Duncan actually seems quite relieved, and Lindsay and Harold would both be comforting Trent since they feel bad for him about him getting cheated on and whatnot. Trent is kind of unresponsive to it because Trent, even though he is hurt, is kind of over it. Not like over it, but in Aftermath he kind of got all his feelings out and he just doesn't want to be upset about it anymore. But what he is upset about is Justin. Because Trent coming back from the game, he has been watching all the Aftermaths on the show with all his friends, and he knows that Justin is cheating. He knows like an undeniable fact Justin has been cheating. But I think the producers would like tell him something like, you can't, say those things in the show because it's an unfair advantage to the contestants. So Trent is now kind of working to try and undermine Justin's cheating and, catch him. Duncan would still pass originally by cheating. Harold would still pass by doing what he did. I think Chef would tell Justin, about what's going to happen, and Chef would intentionally try to miss. And he'd also cut out little holes for Justin in his metal hat so that he can just run by. And he does, but Trent does notice this, and Trent calls him out for it after he passes. He tells Chris, like, look at Justin's mask, there's holes in it. But Chris doesn't really think it's enough to, like, call him out for cheating, because he just thinks, like, oh, maybe the production team maybe made the mask poorly, and Chef just sucks at hitting, so he didn't hit him. I don't think Lindsay would pass, she'd still fall, and I don't really have a reason to believe that Gwen would pass. So I think she just wouldn't, like, really try that hard, and she'd probably fall. So that would still just lead to these 4 passing. Lindsay would notice Trent kind of burying Justin a little bit. And Lindsay, having still a suspicious feeling about Justin, she would pull Trent into like a nearby bush when they're moving challenge scenes. While she's doing that to Justin would confess to her that he knows that Justin is cheating. And Lindsay would feel really smart because she'd feel like she understood it and she could see why it makes sense now. And she still can't, they still can't tell anybody, but now Lindsay knows too. And Justin going into the next challenge would probably talk with Chef and realize that Trent knows, since Trent was trying to like bury him. And he would tell Chef to deal with it, since he knows that Chef's going to be, in control in the next challenge, since Chef's still giving him illegal information. So in the next challenge, Chef would be instantly targeting Trent, chasing him after the entire plot, trying to get him. And he would capture Trent. Justin would make the same deal he makes with Harold originally about like, you don't want Duncan to win, do you? So then Harold helps him win. This would be even easier now since Justin's, a part of an actual alliance with Harold. So Justin would still get up here. But I think Justin now being a lot more challenge oriented, and he wouldn't like think Courtney is attractive anymore since there's no reason for that to really happen at all. Since, he doesn't care about those sort of things. Justin, I think now would just instantly not question about the fact of having to push Courtney off, and he would just go ahead and do it. Courtney would get thrown off, and Justin would win immunity. When it comes to the vote, I think a repeat would kind of happen of what happened in Superhero. Courtney would obsessively want Gwen out, and Justin and Harold, both being a part of an alliance, would also agree to vote out Gwen. But now I think that Lindsay knows for a fact, like an undeniable fact, that Justin has been cheating. she wouldn't want to vote for them anymore, especially now since she knows she has Trent. And if they work with Duncan and Gwen, they have the numbers. I did think for a while they'd vote out Harold, but I realized that Lindsay and Trent wouldn't really want to get rid of Harold since Lindsay kind of likes him and Trent also kind of likes him. And Gwen, again, still doesn't really have beef with him, and Gwen would feel pretty uncomfortable at this point of Courtney constantly being on her. So I think they would want Courtney gone more, considering she has proven to be a more dangerous threat. Considering last time she won immunity, there was a time between here for mute reward, she won immunity. She proved very dominant in this challenge. Like, they just think she's too big of a threat to keep in the game. Even though Lindsay and Trent would kind of feel bad because, you know, she got somewhat cheated on with Duncan, they'd still vote her out because she's too dangerous and she's pretty bossy, so they don't really have any emotional attachment to her. Now, this is a reward challenge, which means it shouldn't be important, but I did consider a few things about it, and I do think there are a few things that make this important. To start off first, the challenge starts off originally with Harold finding a USB stick in his food, and they plug it into Courtney's PDA to get the first clue. But now that Courtney's gone, they don't have a PDA, so I'm assuming that Chris or, you know, whoever would just leave a phone and they'd plug it into that and they'd figure out this thing. Courtney was the one who in the original figured out what all the clues were to the safe and how they had to get to Chris. But I really find it weird that Harold didn't figure it out because he's like a movie nerd, so he should have been able to figure those things out. And even if he didn't, I see Trent figuring it out. Like, I really think for enough time they would have figured it out, so they could have just done it. It's not like Courtney being gone for that is a super big deal. They would have still figured out where Chris is and opened the safe, and they didn't get reward for that, so it doesn't matter who solved it. But I think collectively they could solve it. I do think with a free phone just being out on the table, I think Lindsay in particular would be really wanting a phone because she really seems like, you know, a popular social media person type. So I think she'd wait till everyone's gone. I think she'd pocket the phone that was left at the scene. I think Harold would still become like detective-like in this episode, thinking it's a murder and wanting to investigate everybody. And Duncan would still get accused because Harold doesn't really like Duncan, and he think he would also view Duncan as a viable option for this. And Lindsay would still be kind of being treated like a, you know, an idiot, not really knowing what she's doing as she was in the original. I think people would still just kind of view her as a dimwit. But I think she would also still figure out the case of it being who the murderer was, just because she did it in the original, and I have no reason to believe she wouldn't now. Lindsay would realize, you know, with everyone, that Justin would be kind of upset with her after the last vote. And he does still kind of have like an unofficial alliance with her in the pre-merge. So Lindsay would take Justin so that she can kind of repair the bond that was broken. While they were talking at the movies, she would talk with him a lot about, like, you know, wanting to work with him and liking him. And Justin would also really want to work with Lindsay. Justin would probably believe that she's the easiest competition to beat at the end, since everyone thinks she's not very smart. She's not very athletic, so I think Justin would be like, if I could go to the end with you, and it's a physical challenge, I could win. And I think Justin, to make sure he can earn that trust with her, would tell her that he has been cheating, and he's willing to work with her, and they can go to the end together, you know, if they just keep working together under the low like this. And Lindsay would have known that this is going to happen, since Lindsay is kind of being smart now, and Lindsay would have recorded the conversation on the phone that she got of, you know, Justin admitting to cheating, and even in certain challenges, Lindsay would go to give the phone to Chris, and then she'd show the phone, and she'd struggle to trying to find the audio clip a bit, and before she can actually show it to Chris would instantly just get upset that Lindsay stole the phone, and like take it from her hand, and saying like, you can't have this, you know, contestants aren't allowed to have phones, naughty Lindsay, how dare you break the rules, kind of like an ironic, you know, total drama humor. And the episode would probably end with Lindsay cursing at the camera since she got so close. Now we're on to rock and roll. There's nothing really that important that happens pre-challenge. They just kind of talk in cafeteria, doesn't matter. The first part of the challenge was guitar playing, and I think instantly in the original, Harold, Justin, and Lindsay all did bad, and I do have reason to believe both Gwen and Trent would be good at this, since Trent actually plays guitar, and since Gwen is kind of, you know, heavy rock metal fan, so I think she'd enjoy doing it. But I still do think Duncan would win, because I don't think anybody would try less hard than Duncan, which is why he won in the original, because Chris was like, it's a real rock star to not try, and Duncan didn't try. So Duncan would win the first part of the advantage. Second part of the challenge is like our one-way rock with fans and stuff from paparazzi. Originally, Harold does terribly. Duncan makes fun of Harold, and then Harold screams and chops everyone's heads off, so he definitely wouldn't win. And I don't think Gwen would be very good, because she'd be real gloomy and dark, and she wouldn't enjoy all the attention, so she'd be, real against it. I do actually see all Duncan, Trent, and Justin doing well. I don't think Duncan would win because Duncan was kind of aggressive, and Lindsay is actually the one who won originally, because she did the best with the fans. I kind of don't really feel like she would win against Justin or Trent because they're both more likable than her. And she did do very well, but I do think also of her being smarter, and she'd be really agitated over the whole Justin thing just happening recently. She'd be too on edge for it to work. If Trent and Justin were going out like in the real public, Trent would win because Trent just has so much popularity at this point. But with like fake things, Justin kind of exemplifies, showing off and being popular. So I do think he'd actually win the second part of the challenge. But the last part of the challenge, which is actually for invincibility, is to trash like a backstage room as much as you possibly can, and Justin gets 10 extra seconds to do so. But it doesn't matter, because Justin's not destroying an entire set. He's not a very destructive person. He can't really do that sort of thing. Lindsay, same thing. She's a bit, too dim-witty to break things. Harold wasn't very good. I don't really have a reason to believe Trent would be good. And now, since it's between Duncan and Gwen, I do think this is the part where Gwen would win, because I think Gwen would have a lot of pent-up aggression and pent-up rage about everything that happened with Courtney and how she's being betrayed as a terrible person, even when she hasn't done technically anything to cheat. All she's done is develop emotions, which, isn't good. But she hasn't actually done anything with Duncan. All this aggression would come out in the form of her destroying the room to obliteration, basically how Courtney did, and her winning immunity. And I also think through this, complete destruction of a room, I think she would realize what she did with Duncan wasn't very, good. And more importantly, she's kind of seen how apathetic Duncan's been about the whole situation. He hasn't really felt any mercy for Courtney or felt bad for the things he's been doing. Gwen wouldn't really like that, and I think she'd want to prove that she's not that type of person. She would orchestrate a vote against Duncan to prove that she's not like that. Harold would obviously go along with the vote since he doesn't like him. And Justin would also like to go along the vote since, he's kind of in a wary position where he's afraid about alliances and stuff. Even though Lindsay and Trent both kind of had this plan to orchestrate against Justin, I don't think they'd want to risk having a tie. Because the best thing to do at this point now is, since Harold, Justin, and Gwen are voting for Duncan, is tie by voting with Duncan. There's the chance that Justin wins, and now Justin knows, they are against them. And there's the chance that Duncan wins, and now Harold feels betrayed by them and Gwen. So now, Duncan could probably still get them to go back. So it'd really just be a bad situation for them. And I think Trent could convince Lindsay, we can't do this right now, it's too risky. And they'd vote out Duncan 5-1. Reward challenge, God, does it matter? There's a few things to mention here, actually. The first things first, the teams were separated by gender originally. But we actually have a gender imbalance now. Originally, Owen sits out of the challenge because he's a mole, but we don't have a mole now, so there's no reason for that to happen. So I think instead of a sit out per se of a challenge, it'd be unfair for Chris to just make one of the free guys, not be able to win the reward. I think you would say Gwen winning the last challenge, she can get a pass to the next part of the challenge without having to complete this first part. So now it would be, teams of 2 and 2. And I'd say it's probably Justin and Harold, since they maybe he just let them choose the teams, and it'd be Trent and Lindsay. And as for the fighters, I do think Harold would want to fight because Harold was all honorable and he wanted to do all the fighting styles, and Justin wouldn't really want to fight. And then I think Trent wouldn't want Lindsay to have to fight against a guy, so I think Trent would then want to fight. And this would kind of be a little scene of Lindsay and Justin both being kind of bossy, showing off how good their fighters are. Same with kind of Duncan and Courtney, except now it's them. And I do think Harold would still win in that fight, therefore taking Justin and Harold to the next part of the challenge with Gwen. But also, since Lindsay and Trent are together doing, kitchen work as their punishment, I think they would be able to talk, and Lindsay would be able to tell Trent, that she has, an audio recording of Justin admitting to cheating. they just need to find the phone. And that's been the thing, that was also kind of a storyline last episode of Lindsay. She was trying to find, when to get the phone, but the only place she could think of it being is like in Chris's little mini lodge, which usually has Chris in it, except for in the challenges, but she can't really just sneak away from the challenge. So she's having trouble trying to find a way to sneak in there and not getting caught since she's not very sneaky. So she tells Trent about this, and Trent now knows, like, we have proof, we just need to get it. And when it comes to the actual challenge for the reward, I think Gwen would just see, like, how dangerous the challenge is with the rock climbing and the big Sasquatch and just abstain since she doesn't really care about the reward. And she just would go back and hang out with these two. Harold and Justin, I think Justin would probably throw Harold under the bus at some point in the challenge, like maybe knock his water over, or like as he's about to fall, he doesn't help him so he can win the reward. Pre-challenge stuff doesn't really matter. The first part of this challenge was they were in the spaceship sort of thing, that roller coaster that spin that created zero gravity. And originally Courtney and Beth won the first part of the challenge. They solved the problem because Owen broke open a window because he was a saboteur, and then Courtney and Beth both stick him in the window, so they win the challenge for doing that. Now that Owen isn't here, Owen wouldn't, break the window. And originally the only thing that happened was that like Chris said something about like error or something, like the ship failure, and then Harold was like, we need to touch that lever, and then Harold touched the lever and it stopped. So based on that very lame challenge now, I'm assuming Harold would win that, because Harold is the one who touched the lever. Harold is the one who figured out that you need to go get the lever. So I'm assuming Harold would win, and the reward, the advantage for this challenge was deciding the order of like the throw up thing. And talking with Justin, they would both agree they want to go last. But Justin would convince him he wants to go very, very last. And then I think when it comes to just challenge order, Justin would want Trent to go since he thinks Trent is still like against him, and he would want Gwen to go second because he also thinks Gwen's kind of against her, and he kind of thinks Lindsay's still with them, so he wants Lindsay to go third because he wants to give like his alliance the best chance of winning the challenge by watching Trent and Gwen fail. And now with the actual throw up spinny thing, Trent would go first, and he would just stop the machine before he has to throw up, because he would think it's just really gross and inhumane to make people ride in his throw up. Like, even for people he hates, he wouldn't want that to happen. Like, that's just a nasty thing. Gwen would kind of do a similar thing, but she'd probably last a bit longer than Trent just because she has a stronger stomach. But Lindsay would throw up everywhere, since that's what she did in the original, making the entire thing gross and terrible. Harold already didn't do well in the original. He lasted like 5 seconds or something and then gave up. And I think Justin would decide to go in, but he'd go in by cheating. He would take off his shirt again, distracting everybody momentarily, from how beautiful he is. And then Chef would quickly get a secondary pod that looks the same as the original pod and put it on the thing and quickly take off the one that's full of vomit. And maybe like Trent or Lindsay would notice and they'd call him out, but Chris would be too distracted by Justin's body and not think there's anything suspicious. And then Justin would win the challenge since the pod is now completely clean, and maybe Chef like also messes with the speed so it doesn't go. Basically Justin wins by cheating. But this is where Trent and Lindsay would have a talk with Harold, since like they're both trying to figure out how to sneak in. We'd have to be a ninja, and then Trent realizes Harold has a bunch of weird skills and he's like talked about being a ninja and stuff. So Trent talks to Harold one-on-one about helping him sneak into Chris's thing to get the phone. Harold seems like against it. He doesn't want to do that. He thinks that's breaking the rules. And then Trent tells him what Justin's been doing, and Harold's in disbelief. He doesn't believe him because he's been in alliance with Justin, and he genuinely trusts Justin. Trent convinces Harold of like all the times Justin put himself above him, like last challenge when he threw him under for a reward challenge, how he's kind of been using him like a lackey in the Princess Pride and the superhero, like how Justin's not really his friend. And Harold would sneak into the place, he'd get the phone, and an elimination ceremony where Justin be acting like real cocky about winning, and he says it doesn't even matter if nobody shows up because he's still going to be fine. And he gives the phone to Lindsay, who instantly finds the audio recording she originally took and plays it, and it's Justin confessing to cheating the entire season. And Chris looks at Chef asking him if it's true, and Chef's like bad at lying, and he confesses to everything. Tris was being so mad that Chef was helping Justin cheat the entire time, he would instantly eliminate Justin for cheating. And Justin would kind of realize when he got eliminated that he had underestimated Lindsay the entire time. So with the original, everyone chose their animals, but it was also kind of an order thing. Whoever got the animal first, first come, first serves. So I had to consider who would want what animal and who would act the quickest to get that animal. Harold would act the quickest to get the chameleon because he, is kind of an animal nerd, and he'd think like, oh, chameleons are cool and I want to learn more about them. I know so much about them. They're reptilians and whatnot. Lindsay would also jump at the opportunity to get the raccoon because she thinks it's cute and it's like a dog, not really, understanding what it is. And then Gwen and Trent would be left with a shark and a bear, both two terrible options. I think Gwen would let Trent choose which one he wants, because Gwen doesn't, Gwen's trying to make amends with him somewhat. And even though it's obviously not enough, Trent, appreciates the gesture, and I think he would choose the bear, since he would view it easier to like teach tricks. And it looks like a pretty pacified bear, since in the original the bear is like very lazy since it works with Owen, which leaves Gwen with the shark. Okay, I could talk about the talent show that they're doing, but it doesn't matter because you don't actually get a reward, so that's cool. I mean, I spent so much time deciding what they were going to do for the talent show just to find out that it does not matter. There is no reward. It is not even mentioned. It might as well just be a precursor because it doesn't matter at all. When it comes to the actual challenge of them all being like in the woods, Gwen would have to push a shark in a tank, and I think maybe she'd push it for a decent mile. Then they'd get near a river and the shark would escape the cage because it really wants to get away from Gwen, and it would jump into the river swimming away, and Gwen would just be annoyed. The shark is such an unfair one to get because they're asking you to bring a shark to an area that has no water. So I think Gwen would just realize it's completely like an unfair animal to get, and it's just impossible to even win with. So she would just give up on the shark and go try and like help Trent to again try and make amends. I think Harold would kind of take Duncan's place in this episode of, the chameleon hiding from him, and then Harold getting real paranoid and stuff. Lindsay would then take Beth's place, and the raccoon would still help her and get through the challenge. Gwen would help Trent out from the ditch that Duncan originally falls in, and this would kind of be a point where they would like have a heart-to-heart talking about what happens, and Gwen would really earnestly apologize for what happened and say she's okay if Trent doesn't forgive her, but she does want him to know she's very sorry for what she did. Lindsay would probably win because Beth won originally because the raccoon was really smart for some reason and just like knew his way around the forest, and that wouldn't change if Lindsay suddenly got it. So I think Lindsay would still win the challenge, so she'd have immunity this time. But I don't think it really matters, because I think Gwen, feeling like she doesn't really deserve the win after what she did, and now that she made amends with Trent, I think she would just want to quit. I think she would just quit the competition since she feels happy with what she has done, and she doesn't really feel like she deserves to win the game. Originally, this episode was a double elimination, but I just decided to have it one elimination since we have 2 episodes and 3 people. For Mutiny on a Soundboard stage, I'm just going to have it now instead of like whoever gets there first wins. Whoever gets there last gets instantly eliminated is what I'm going with now. Now I considered a couple things in this challenge of like trivia and like physical ability, and I thought Lindsay was going to lose by a long shot, but I went back and I went to watch the episode, and a lot of the questions asked are kind of really personal, like drama things. And Lindsay's kind of good with those sort of things. She's kind of like in the field of those like, relationships and dynamics and, those sort of drama things. So I think she would actually know a decent amount of the questions. And Harold knows a lot about some people, but he also knows close to nothing with other people. And then Trent's kind of the same case. So I think in general Trent would do not the best, but I also think he's probably the best like challenge-wise out of these 3. So I do think it'd be close with all 3 of them, just because it's really hard to tell who has the advantage. No one here has like a very distinct advantage of knowledge or challenge strength that leads me to believe any one person would be like miles ahead. So originally Duncan gets knocked with like a safe that's shot by Chris and Chef into like the earthquake hole. And I think this time it would be Trent, and I think Harold would help him, since Harold's like honorable. Lindsay would have already left on the zipline at this point, You know, she's already made it to the finale. At this point, she's already gone to the door, and now it's like a race between Trent and Harold. And I do just believe that Harold would win the race, since we have seen him like run like, you know, really fast sometimes, and he runs kind of like a animal. So I do think he would then make it to the finale, and I think Trent would be a little bit behind him. And then, you know, Lindsay and Harold would get different winning endings. This is how I generally view what I view happening. What if DJ never had an alliance with Chef? Again, I kind of lean a little bit too much into plot armor, and it's something I am going to try and fix if I'm ever to do what ifs again. But also, this was kind of a lot. I'm hoping that if you've stayed this long of this 50-minute or something video, that you had a good time. And if you didn't, I'm sorry I took an hour from your life you'll never get.